So let's have a look at Japanese tourism that started roughly in the 1920s. Actually, Japanese tourism started before that, but it wasn't really on a large scale. It really starts to take off significantly in the 1920s. Hopefully this lecture will explain a little bit better how Korea ended up falling under Japanese colonial rule through commerce in a sense as well, and how the diplomatic relationship between Korea and Japan ended up resuming after 1965. In a sense, perhaps you could argue that tourism played a small role in both these aspects of Korean history. But let's have a look at the start of a Japanese tourism industry in the colonial period. You see here a pamphlet of the Sontag Hotel. I believe it was one of the first hotels for foreigners in Korea. It may have been the first. And it was quite luxurious. And there are many postcards and images of the hotel because people had a memorable experience there. You see also a station of Naegeumgang. Again, it's an important site for many tourists traveling. And so postcards were an important part of travel. It was what we do these days with social media. We, in a sense, show off where we go, and it's kind of like a certain bucket list of things that you might want to tick off. Group tours started roughly in 1906, but as I said, it wasn't really until the 1920s that tourism became a really kind of significant industry. Aspects that Japanese tourists enjoyed were sites of important battles, of course, victories involving the Japanese. And so you have the Hyunmumun on the left here, and you can see the site of another important battle of the Russo-Japanese War that also became an important site of, in a sense, perhaps pilgrimage. Group tours really were, I guess, the majority as early as 1906, and maybe it was also partly because it wasn't as well set up yet for tourism. So the sites were limited, and perhaps because information was also limited, it was easier as a traveler to go on a tour. It's a little bit like how people like to go to North Korea these days. Although it wasn't as dangerous as perhaps as a foreigner as North Korea may be, but certainly a certain sense of security may have also driven people to easily sign up for a group tour back in 1906. Later on, when the industry of course grows further, people are much happier to travel individually, perhaps with just a partner and with children. The most interesting, I believe, aspect of tourism in the colonial period is that it sought to portray Korea, of course, as part of the bigger Japan, but also as a site that had a little bit of both the modern and the past. So in a sense, what they did was portray Korean native culture as more backward than it really was. And at the same time, they also wanted people to feel comfortable that they could visit sites where things were really, in a sense, backward. And the word is actually used sometimes in old contemporary sources, but without a lot of trouble. And so the images that sometimes were even published as little tour guides for use by Japanese tourists, they show a little bit of both. They have the rural images, and then they have modern facilities. Just to make sure that the tourist could see that you could easily go, in a sense, to the past and then head back to the present. And the information provided by the guides was very detailed. And if you look at some of the old guides that I'm sure you can find in your library and maybe online as well, you can see that they indicate very clearly that you can go from this hotel to that traditional site in 6 minutes. And it will also indicate what route is best to take and whether it's more convenient or less convenient. And so they really made sure that people could travel to Korea and to rural areas as well as comfortably as possible. So in a sense, to summarize, when you look at how tourism is sold to Japanese tourists, it is this juxtaposition between the past and the present, or if you like, the future, because the facilities that they were relying on were really all very new, and the Japanese certainly tried to make sure they were very punctual and very convenient. Among the things that the tourists enjoyed, apart from sending postcards, of course, back home to say, hey, look, I've already been to Korea, but you haven't, was to collect little mementos of their trip to Korea. It's not entirely clear what kinds of things they collected, but it's quite obvious that stamps, for example, special stamps, were among the things that people collected. You can see that to a degree in Japan today as well, that when you go to certain temples, they still allow you to stamp your entry card with a local stamp. And that existed at the time in Korea as well. So postcards, special stamps, and of course some small items. What they exactly were, I'm not sure. But the industry quickly picked up on this kind of burgeoning industry of travelers who wanted something Korean. Companies that tried to make use of this industry without trying to be Korean were watch companies. Watch companies saw that it was important for the present, the modern, remember, to promote kind of punctuality. And so watch companies often had advertisements where they included images that portrayed someone with a watch being very punctual but also cosmopolitan. And so a number of ads showed a globe just to kind of embed this image that if you had a watch, you were probably more kind of cosmopolitan than other people. They also made use of the so-called Time Day. Time Day was on the 10th of June each year, and it was a day in which the administration tried to emphasize the importance of being punctual. And so the ads on that day were large in number, and they all tried to promote the use of clocks and watches because to be punctual was a good thing. On that day, for example, all the bells initially back in the 20s, and later, of course, sirens, when electric sounds become more common, in schools and at factories, they were played a number of times on that day. Again, to remind people of how important it was to be punctual, and also, if you look at the ads at least, to be cosmopolitan, because a modern citizen of the Japanese Empire was also a very punctual citizen of the Japanese Empire. And so the very same thing was done in Taiwan, which was also a Japanese colony, of course, and Japan proper at the same time on that very same day. And if you look at some of the old photos that still exist of the day. You see that the administration set up sometimes large clocks in the center of the city in Seoul, right in front of the government general building, for example, on one day. They also offered, many of the watch stores, they offered free services on the day. And so you can see that around the Japanese Empire, the day was really used a lot by businesses. And especially businesses hoping to make money off the tourists, in a sense. Because the tourist industry emphasized the need to be punctual, as many people relied on the infrastructure to be on time. So the products in the Japanese colonial period that was intended for use by tourists were very detailed, they were colorful, and they emphasized being cosmopolitan. And so quite often there are also ads for clothing and for kind of other aspects of being a cosmopolitan citizen. Eventually, of course, the colonial period comes to an end, and then we see resorts come up in order to still kind of benefit from tourism. But the Walker Hill initially was not intended for Japanese tourists. It was intended for Americans, affluent American military. That didn't work as well, and so you see that the Walker Hill Resort has to constantly kind of reinvent itself over the years. But eventually, especially after 1965, the number of Japanese tourists start to increase, and they kind of become the most important visitor of the Walker Hill. And so the Japanese tourists then start to take over as the primary kind of tourist to Korea. And they tend to travel for business, so they come for short weekends usually, and they travel in groups. And one of the things this led to in Korea is, of course, engagement with Japanese businessmen on weekends, and also the kind of a thriving karaoke business. And so in the 70s and 80s, before noraebang existed, and I'm sure you're familiar with noraebang today, karaoke was the big thing. And so a lot of businesses around important centers for Japanese tourism in Seoul, for example, would offer karaoke. There is, however, a big difference between karaoke and noraebang, which I'm sure you're aware of, and that is that the karaoke implies being able to drink alcohol. And so the experience of karaoke in Korea was rather different for the tourists, the Japanese tourists then, compared to Japanese tourists these days going to a noraebang, for example, where there's no alcohol. And so I guess an interesting thing is that the Japanese, in a sense, did drive the development of, I guess, the karaoke technology in Korea, and we see the effect of that today. Of course, we have coin karaoke now, or coin noraebang, and we have noraebang. But in a sense, that is certainly driven by its popularity with Japanese tourists in the 70s and 80s. Eventually, though, Japanese tourists became not the biggest group, they became the second biggest group when in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, a lot of Chinese tourists start to come to Korea as well. And I believe that today, Chinese tourists are the biggest group of tourists, and Japanese tourism is still very important. It's just slightly smaller than that, in terms of number at least, than that of the Chinese tourists. So over the years, we've seen quite an interesting development. You go from a colonial kind of administration-driven tourism to what we have today, where in a sense, the power dynamic has drastically changed. So now Korea, in a sense, is driving entertainment, and it's, in a sense, also an economic powerhouse. Whereas in the beginning, Japanese tourists in the colonial period were very much in power, and so everybody had to, in a sense, serve their needs. One interesting aspect that I haven't yet mentioned is that even the giseng, the entertainment women, who were incredibly popular with Japanese tourists in the 1920s and 30s, that even they had to, in a sense, abide by this Japanese need for punctuality. And so if you look at old postcards of the colonial period, there is actually a rather popular set of postcards that features images of giseng, and it has clocks also printed alongside images of the young women, which were very popular with Japanese tourists. And what it basically did is to, in a sense, emphasize to the Japanese tourists that these women were very talented and highly trained in performing arts, traditional performing arts. And in a sense, they represented, I guess, a Korean tradition, Korean heritage. However, they were also very punctual. And so you see that in the clocks that are printed on the postcards as well, it is very clear what is indicated there in terms of when they work. Which, in other words, even things that supposedly may have looked traditional and out of touch with modernity and therefore perhaps impractical, those things too were very, in a sense, managed. They were punctual, and if you were a Japanese tourist, you could go and see them and not waste any time before heading back to your hotel. But all that was an experience where the Japanese, in a sense, were superior politically, and so they were all serving the Japanese from a period of, in a sense, subservience, political subservience, which of course is sad, and of course that's why this led to a kind of post-colonial a kind of sentiment and trauma. What you see now is, in a sense, the flip side of that, where Japanese are so desperate to come to Korea and experience some of the things they've fallen in love with on their screens or through their headphones. And so the power balance has, of course, shifted considerably, which I think Korea deserves very much to be experiencing. And that, in a sense, sums up this interesting kind of shift in the dynamic of Japanese tourism as foreigners here in Korea.
Thank you.